In 1477, the Duke of Clarence said that his brother, King Edward, practiced the black arts and used his knowledge of witchcraft to concoct poisons for the king's enemies. The Scottish king Macbeth was one of several early Scottish monarchs who were crowned killers. Many times, aided and abetted by sorcerers and witches, Scottish noblemen would kill a king, seize the throne for themselves, and then in turn meet with a violent death at the hands of another murdering monarch. In 1437, King James of Scotland was stabbed to death by a bunch of henchmen wielding swords and daggers. They were ordered to kill King James I by the Earl of Atholl, who claimed he was the rightful king of Scotland. The king's son, James II, stabbed to death the 8th Earl of Douglas in 1452. The Earl was the biggest landowner in Scotland. 3 years after being murdered by the king, the Earl's land was annexed by the Crown Estates. Well, I knew at one point today that we were going to discuss the subject of treason. And what happens to people who are guilty of treason. Diana was most certainly a person who committed very, very serious treason. The Panorama interview that Martin Bashir did with Diana is one long treasonous offence. I think that if Diana had not committed treason, she had not made that Panorama documentary, then the chances are that she would still be alive to this day. Well, what I've done is I've brought along a few books today that are from my own personal collection. I've got a huge library. Some of my books go back to the medieval era, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century manuscripts and that kind of thing. And there is this whole notion that was suggested in David Icke's book, The Biggest Secret, which really portrayed the crash in the tunnel as being the beginning of a whole ritual sacrifice of Diana. And of course, people that were guilty of treason were ritually sacrificed. And I made a film recently in my series of Illuminati films called Murdered by the Monarchy. And in that film you can see the terrible ritual killing of people who had their bodies cut into different pieces, and they used to cut the heart of the traitor out and put this on display publicly. And parts of the body of the traitor were distributed for various rituals amongst the aristocratic and royal nobility, the elite of Europe. And people say to me, it's not true, is it, that royal people are involved in black magic? Well, I just laugh at that, because the whole of the European royal elite, the aristocratic, noble, political, leading elite of society, throughout the whole of history, have been involved in the occult. And so I've brought a few books along today to just illustrate some of the most notorious black magician type characters that have populated the ranks of royal families and the nobility and the aristocracy throughout the ages. So I think we just have a look at them here. This is the castle, the famous castle at Taufouge in France, which was previously the home of a very wealthy man called Gilles de Retz, or Gilles de Retz. Now, he was the Marshal of France, a very successful military career. He retired at an early age in his mid-20s, and he then took on the study of black magic in this castle. And he was a member of the nobility. He'd formerly assisted Joan of Arc in her campaigns against the British. And he performed black magic rituals in this castle with the help of an Italian priest called Preletti. And so many children were going missing wherever Gilles de Retz appeared that eventually his black magic came under the scrutiny of the authorities, and he was eventually arrested, tortured, and executed. And he was executed on charges of taking no less than 150 children, though it's quite likely that he was responsible for the sacrifice, so the killing, and sadomasochistic black magic rituals with these children, probably in the number of thousands and thousands of children. And this kind of thing is still going on in France and Belgium and the United Kingdom amongst the nobility to this day. And we know this because there was a famous case in Belgium recently. A chap called Marc Dutroux was arrested, and he was found in possession of keys to dungeons which were located under houses in suburban areas in Belgium. And these children were kept imprisoned. They'd been snatched, and these children were just some of the literally millions of people that go missing every year. And Marc Dutroux's confession alleges that all he was doing was procuring children for sadomasochistic use by very, very wealthy people in Belgium. He claims that certain members of the European nobility were involved. And of course the word sadomasochism, or the term sadomasochism, sado is from the name of Sade, the Marquis de Sade, who's another member of the French nobility, and he used to, get young girls from local villages and used to partake in sadomasochistic, horrible, evil kind of soirees. This is the famous Madame de Montespan, who was the mistress of King Louis XIV of France. Ms. Montespan actually hired a black magician to put a spell on the king's wife to ensure that the king's wife would never have any children. She was also the employer of a priest who used to perform black masses. This priest was called Abbé Guibourg, and he used to perform various black masses for members of nobility and perform sacrifices of children with a naked woman laying on the altar. And again we see this link between royalty and sacrifice. It's a it's historically it's all there, except it's been swept under a very plush carpet. Well, Hampton Court Palace is one of the most haunted places, not only in Britain, but in the entire world. And it was the official palace, the official residence of the royal family. It was originally built in the 1200s, and then it was massively added to in the 1500s. And many famous royal people have had their homes at Hampton Court. Henry VIII is one, and Henry VIII was a psychopath. He was somebody that would fly into royal tempers, and he would decree that a certain person had committed adultery and therefore had committed treason, and would behead them. Not a very nice chap at all, Henry VIII, even though he wrote a good piece of music called Greensleeves. Now, one of his wives that he accused of being adulterous and therefore being treasonous was a woman called Catherine Howard. And Catherine Howard realised as soon as that she had been accused of adultery, she knew that she was going to have her head cut off. So she ran to see the king to plead mercy for him, but she never made it because the palace guards arrested her and dragged her away. And still to this day, from time to time, you can hear the screams of the ghost of Catherine Howard, and she was dragged away through a part of the palace which is now called the Haunted Gallery. There's no doubt that Hampton Court is most definitely infested with psychic activity and with ghosts. One of the most common things that happens at Hampton Court is that this grey ghostly mist hangs above the floors in the kitchens, and this is ectoplasm. And I made a film called Spirit World which discusses ectoplasm, and many of the people that work in the kitchens of Hampton Court, which is partly opened to the public each day, many people who work in those kitchens have seen this ectoplasm, which is a mist. Hampton Court is a gigantic structure. It's a gigantic royal palace. It's more than 1,000 individual rooms. Now, one of these rooms were recently discovered. I go back now to the time of Henry VIII. Henry VIII's wife, Jane Seymour, she died giving birth to the young Prince Edward. The young prince had a nurse who was called Mrs. Penn, and this is in the 1500s, and she was buried actually inside Hampton Court grounds at the old chapel. But in the 1800s that chapel was demolished and her grave was disturbed. And from that moment onwards, workmen kept hearing this kind of constant whirring sound coming from behind a wall in Hampton Court Palace.